Up next is me. I'm Daniel Murphy. I'm a professor of anthropology here at the University of Cincinnati. Today we're going to be talking about knowing our future forests, exploring the institutional and cultural dynamics of uncertainty and knowledge in forest planning. And really what I'm honing in on here is that future aspect and the theme for the conference. And what I'm really thinking about here is how people think about the future. So there's not as much in here about forests per se, but rather about how people think about those forests in various ways. Okay. So current trajectories of global climate change call for a dramatic rethinking of the ways in which human communities craft relationships with each other in the natural world. Where I mostly work in the American West, the two sort of glaring examples of that kind of dramatic change are the increase in intensity of wildfire, as well as pine beetle kill that you can see in forests in the American West pretty clearly. However, current forms of probabilistic forecasting and global climate trend models mask vast uncertainties about what will not only likely happen, but might or could happen. This conditional shift should radically reorient our anticipatory stance from one marked by narrow, risk-oriented probability trajectories to a greater window of possibility. Further, it necessitates speculative thinking in the vein of what scholars deem post-normal science. This is an epistemological inclusiveness moving beyond modernist assumptions about risk and objectivity in science to a wider array of critical approaches to diverse and uncertain knowledges and futures. And this graph right here is really just one way to sort of describe context in which you would apply post-normal science. So post-normal science is something that we, epistemological perspective that we would use in conditions marked by high uncertainty, very significant values context, or high stakes. Okay? Those are not contexts in which science is necessarily going to lead us to the right decision. Okay? And this, in some ways, can be a positive, and I may be there. That's definitely a conditional maybe. Right? And I draw on this quote: "When nothing is sure, everything is possible." So there is this sense that there is some hope here. Okay? That this opens a window for conversation. Okay. And so within climate adaptation and natural resource management planning and forest planning, this reorientation calls for new tools for conceptualizing diverse futures. Scenarios are one such tool that have received increasing attention. And this graph, it's very similar to that graph about post-normal science. In this context, though, what we're trying to see is where scenarios fit in terms of what kinds of data and knowledge you would use in a decision-making context. So in conditions that are marked by medium to high uncertainty or medium to high complexity, we're going to use techniques like scenarios. So we've moved beyond facts, predictions, or more risk-oriented thinking into that possibilistic thinking. Okay? So here, what I'm going to be focusing on are scenarios as narratives or qualitative descriptions of alternative futures, rather than the trend models that we are all pretty aware of, that are exemplified by IPCC scenarios. So unlike global climate models, scenarios permit users to craft possible futures through iterative reflexive dialogue. Within the context of future climate change, scenarios offer significant potential as a vehicle to bring climate model data into planning conversations while maintaining a clear embrace of future uncertainty, and a more expansive approach to adaptation as a form of world building. So this is something I came up with to kind of explain sort of a way to think about scenarios and their utility in those kinds of contexts that are marked by high uncertainty. All right, so if we consider here, the bottom arrow is the flow of time, time being simply change, right? Time's not a thing, changes, right? And so the first oval here is now. That's our window of now, okay? And when we look forward into the future, we make certain decision points, and those decision points lead us on different paths, okay? And so it gets us out into what we call, when we're thinking of different time horizons, whether that time horizon is 10 years or 100 years or 1,000 years, right? It opens up what we call a possibility window. So if we're thinking about risk-oriented sort of thinking, that's going to narrow that window of possibility. Okay? It necessarily does that. Here, what scenarios do, and what we're talking about here, is opening up that window of possibility to a much broader range of futures. So my colleagues and I have been intrigued by the potential of these sorts of tools to create and implement action on the ground. However, this has been much harder than many of us anticipated. Funded by the Rocky Mountain Research Station of the U.S. Forest Service, our pilot project began in 2012 as a test of the potential scenarios to elicit future vulnerabilities and adaptation through community dialogue. Working with communities in the Big Hole Valley, Montana, and Grand Lake County, Colorado, as well as with participants from local, state, and federal natural resource management agencies, we found that scenarios were particularly adept at revealing unanticipated synergies and incommensurabilities, findings that were even surprising to participants. And all of that's largely been published. But drawing on those lessons learned from these pilots and the desire to utilize scenarios in a forest planning or decision-making context, my colleagues started a collaboration with the North Central Climate Science Center and other partners to create landscape-scale adaptation plans. The results of that work are still in a preliminary stage, but data from both the pilot investigations and the subsequent climate adaptation project identified substantial obstacles and challenges to using scenarios within contemporary decision-making contexts, particularly those with federal resource management agencies that have multiple use mandates, such as the Forest Service. And that project took place in the Gunnison and San Juan watershed, which are in southwest Colorado. And it's still ongoing and has not been published on yet. So, beginning in 2017, my colleagues and I, thinking about these obstacles, we began investigating the perceived challenges to the use of scenarios in these contexts. We identified 27 resource agency personnel from the U.S. Park Service and U.S. Forest Service who had experienced or utilized a scenario-based activity within a decision-making or learning context, including both project-based and larger unit-wide or regional scales of planning. Participants noted a number of general challenges with incorporating climate change into planning more broadly, including access to relevant climate data, much of which also manifested in their descriptions of the benefits and challenges posed by scenarios. Some participants were very positive about the use of scenarios, while others were decidedly negative. These dispositions appear to related to a number of factors, including the relative success of activities, as well as educational and disciplinary training. A number of participants spoke directly to the positive benefits espoused by scenarios, by the scenario practice community, including how the narrative, qualitative format of scenario-based practices permits expansive thinking, or as one participant stated, out-of-the-box thinking. Participants found scenarios more creative, diverse, and flexible than other platforms for planning and decision-making. In particular, a number of participants highlighted the way scenarios permit social learning, so learning about each other, rather than just about a particular plan. As they provide not only a safe space for diverse voices, but also the room to build effective teams, to reach compromise and form collaborations beyond their own narrow management or decision spaces. Additionally, unlike planning efforts built around future trajectories or singular or narrowly defined sets of variables, scenario practices they have found allow participants to recreate a richness that they felt better reflected, quote unquote, the real world. This kind of iterative, dynamic role building across diverse sets of voices fostered space for planning that attends to a broader array of unforeseen consequences and more grounded alternatives. Finally, and most importantly, many participants discussed how scenarios allow them to confront and deal with uncertainty, including the uncertainties of climate models, their downscaled effects, and the broader ecological and social impacts they imply. By explicitly confronting uncertainty and shifting the focus from models built on past or current climates, many participants felt they better understood the conditions surrounding future actions. However, despite the seemingly positive utility of scenarios, participants also offered a wide array of challenges and obstacles to scenario use and broader planning efforts. The most salient obstacles were largely logistical. The wide open, expansive nature of narrative-focused scenarios simply did not match institutionalized practices of planning. As such, time was nearly universally discussed as an obstacle. It takes too much time to do these things. Some felt that the social learning focus of many scenario efforts, learning about each other, learning about the other players at the table, wasn't streamlined enough to leverage into decision-making. Some thinking of this almost, quote-unquote, as a waste of time, which is pretty cynical. Others cited a lack of clear, top-down policy about the use of scenarios in planning, while others described the scenarios were an ill fit for federally required environmental assessment processes. The explicit embrace of uncertainty inherent in scenario processes also runs counter to many legal requirements. This happens on two fronts, both perceived and real legal requirements and sort of perception of legal requirements. First, for some participants, scenario practices were excessively inclusive of non-scientific knowledge and information, including indigenous knowledge. These forms of knowledge that do not adhere to institutional and legal requirements prescribed or perceived to be prescribed in federal law or mandated by agency rules. Secondly, there were also disciplinary or cultural objections to the inclusion of non-scientific knowledge. Agency culture, quote-unquote agency culture, for some doesn't permit the kind of space, the space for the kind of highly imaginative, speculative, and reflexive thinking embedded in scenario practices. As one participant described, quote-unquote, I've heard people complain about scenario planning because it's too sort of qualitative and wishy-washy, or touchy-feely, not quantitative enough. At a fundamental level, these sentiments, and there's many, many quotes about this, these sentiments constituted a kind of rejection of scenarios as legitimate vehicles for translating, incorporating, and or grounding uncertain climate change data into planning. Now, what we found in our project was that this unfolded in different ways in different planning contexts. So, for example, we found this a much larger array of negative comments, and particularly these latter perspectives in the Forest Service. We found more positive sort of interpretations of scenario practices and uses of scenario practices in the Park Service. Now, both of these pictures are kind of meant to show how different these agencies are and how different the management and ownership structures of the resources under their management. So, of course, the U.S. Forest Service being multiple-use mandate, there's a lot more array of possible activities that they're managing for, whereas the National Park Service has a much more narrower set of management objectives. Okay, so these unfolded differently depending on which agency the interviewee was speaking from. Now, all of this speaks to a much broader question about adaptive capacity, okay, and how these kinds of futures thinking impacts the ways in which decisions can be made on the land. So in this context, what we see in, for example, the responses from folks in the Forest Service is a sort of rejection of that possibilistic thinking, a more risk-averse attention to what we would call that sort of scientific modernist perspective. And the ultimate result of this is that it shrinks your adaptive capacity. Right? And we can think of that, if we go back to that flow of time, where we see that march through time, decision-making through time, that kind of response constricts, okay, what's possible. And we call that the envelope, okay? We're thinking about pathways, okay? And in the Park Service, what we're seeing is a much broader envelope, much broader range of possibility, less a structure around their decision-making pathways. So these challenges are substantial, but as some of the current planning efforts necessitate moving past them, okay? In the words of one participant, quote unquote, our historical organizational structures aren't serving us well at this point. With massive uncertainty and the integrated nature of all these changes that are happening, socially as well as ecologically. To further the use of scenarios in planning context, participants suggested a number of different efforts. And I'm not going to go through them. But what What is clear is that there must be a balance between those priorities that have clear benefits, including the embrace scenario of uncertainty, and diverse forms of knowledge and expertise. That tension between uncertainty and diverse forms of knowledge and expertise is at the crux not only of scenario-based forms of planning, but of climate adaptation more generally. We suggest developing facilitation and a number of other things to help out creating space for this. But what is clear is that the future scenarios, although the future scenarios may be uncertain, what is certain is that the impacts, of a changing climate on our forests amplify the imperative for this kind of speculative and transformative thinking that's required to foster radical action that is needed. And that's that.